Hi, I'm Jeff Peterson, a research team leader at CNA. I'm here today with David Rodney, who has been conducting research and policy analysis for the Navy on manpower planning issues for the past 40 years. He recently wrote a handbook covering what he has learned about Navy manpower planning over these decades. I'm a retired Marine Corps colonel who had numerous manpower planning assignments during the course of my career. I wish a document like David's handbook had been available back then. It would have helped me get up to speed with many of the manpower issues that I faced. This webinar gives an overview of David's handbook. It's a valuable tool for anyone entering the manpower planning business. So David, why did you write this handbook?
Jeff, first let me thank you for taking the time to discuss this work with me. The Navy is a large organization and needs hundreds of thousands of personnel to operate. Unfortunately, there is no central document or central location where staff can find an explanation of how the Navy manages personnel. Instead, this information is spread out across numerous Navy offices, stored piecemeal in memos, instructions, ad hoc reports, people's memories, you name it. In the past 40 years, I've been working on Navy manpower planning. I've gained some in-depth knowledge on how the Navy manages its workforce. The Navy employs thousands of people in personnel management, many of whom are new to manpower planning, and it can be difficult to get up to speed. I wrote this handbook as a resource for those staff. Managing the Navy's human resources is a complicated process. It includes everything from determining the manpower requirements for the latest submarine to ensuring there is an ample supply of personnel aboard ships to maintain the latest radar system. The issues are complex and difficult.
So David, how complex can it get?
I'll answer this with an example. Consider the task of ensuring that the Navy has an ample supply of proficient destroyer commanding officers in the year 2030. Well, the Navy is not some corporation that can ask a headhunter to scour the country for an executive with the right experience. The Navy has to grow its own. So for this to happen, an extensive sequence of events must be followed over many years. The Navy must have recruited sufficient surface warfare officers 15 to 20 years earlier. The Navy needs to provide career development to these officers. The Navy has to retain enough high-quality officers to provide a good quality cut for selection of officers for career advancement. The promotion of officers in each cohort must meet legal and policy guidelines, and the personnel distribution system has to select excellent officers to fill the commanding officer billets when the vacancies for these assignments arise. Each of these events is complicated and needs to be consistent with the other events. Multi-year planning inevitably involves a lot of uncertainty and trade-offs between short and long-term considerations. The successful management of this task requires an understanding of many personnel management issues and how they are interrelated.
So David, one aspect of your book that I find really helpful is that the information is divided into manageable chunks and it focuses on active duty officers and enlisted personnel. We both know that reserves, civil servants, and contractors are also in the Navy workforce and have their own sets of policies and procedures. But the book, and of course our discussion today, focuses on active duty officers and enlisted personnel. Before we delve any deeper, though, we should introduce some jargon, the language in Navy workforce management. There is a fundamental distinction between the jobs that are required for the Navy to operate and the people who undertake them. The Navy uses manpower to describe the jobs and personnel to describe the people filling the jobs. To refer to the entire process of determining manpower requirements and obtaining and developing personnel to match these requirements, the Navy uses the phrase Manpower, Personnel, Training, and Education, or MPT&E. We'll be using the acronym MPT&E throughout the webinar today. Later, we'll use the term Manpower Requirements, which are statements of the skills and seniority of people required to perform the work under consideration, without regard to any practical constraints, such as fiscal constraints. And finally, a word you will hear throughout the webinar is billet. Each job in the Navy is a billet. A billet can be described by the location of the job, the grade of the job, or by the expertise the job requires. For example, a billet may be for a first class E6 electronics technician aboard the destroyer USS Halsey, DDG 97.
Thanks. Yes, this is good basic information, that jargon that we will need and use, Jeff. So let's start by considering a top-level view of Navy manpower planning that describes the major workforce management processes and shows how they fit together. Navy MPT&E has four major steps. 1. Determining manpower requirements. That's the billets. 2. Obtaining the funding. We call this the programming for the required manpower. 3. Planning to obtain and professionally develop the required personnel. We refer to as the bodies. And 4. Executing personnel plans to match the bodies with the billets. This diagram, taken from the Naval Postgraduate School course, shows a cyclical flow of events and how the elements of MPT&E fit together. The starting point is the National Defence Strategy, which provides a demand signal to the Navy leading to a need for manpower. The Manpower Requirements process produces a detailed set of requirements, the number of billets needed for each Navy activity, specified by skill and seniority level. The next step is the programming process, in which the Navy produces budgets to fund the requirements. The end product of manpower programming is a set of billets funded by Congress called authorized billets, which provides input to the next step in the process, personnel planning. Personnel planning addresses every stage of personnel management, including recruitment, training, career planning and development, advancement or promotion, and managing retention. The end products are plans that enable the Navy to attain the personnel required to man the authorized billets. The final stage in the MPT&E process is personnel execution, when Navy personnel managers take steps to implement the plans. These steps include everything from recruiting of personnel to assigning personnel to jobs. The primary objective of the MPT&E process is the manning of the fleet. That is, assigning the right number of personnel to Navy operational units with the skills, experience, and seniority to match the manpower requirements of those units. Inevitably, fleet manning is imperfect. Hence, there is a feedback loop. MPT&E managers continually monitor the state of fleet manning and amend future plans in response to manning problems.
Thank you, David. And I know from experience that one of the greatest challenges in MPT&E is to prepare for the impact of time, the time that passes as cohorts of personnel gradually age. In essence, we are making decisions today for events and requirements that will occur in the future, which is a leading cause of the complexity of the Navy MPT&E. Navy personnel are almost all recruited at a young age. Then they're trained and developed for lengthy careers. And in reality, there is a closed labor market nature of military personnel. The Navy does not advertise in the New York Times for commanding officers of Navy ships. Instead, the Navy recruits ensigns today to provide commanding officers for tomorrow, 15 to 20 years in the future. This closed labor market imposes many restrictions on Navy personnel. Decisions that are made today will affect Navy personnel for many years. Consequently, personnel managers need to make trade-offs between the state of personnel today and the state of personnel in the future. In other words, meeting today's goals or budgets may have short-term benefits, but adverse effects in the long term and vice versa. Therefore, a central tenet of MPT&E is that plans must reconcile near and long-term goals.
Jeff, you're exactly right. Navy MPT&E is a large enterprise with many offices making interrelated decisions. For example, different staffs have responsibility for recruiting, training, compensation, managing re-enlistments, making assignments, etc. Each office makes plans and decisions in response to the guidance and constraints they receive from higher authority. Some decisions may be correct in isolation, but these decisions may affect each other in ways that are hard to understand. For example, a change in recruiting priorities may lead to an unexpected shortage in personnel for assignments 2 to 3 years in the future. Effective MPT&E management requires an understanding of the relationships and interdependencies between the many parts of Navy MPT&E.
So this diagram shows the key players who feed into the Navy MPT&E. So let's now talk about requirements and programming. So David, how does the Navy determine manpower requirements?
Manpower requirements are divided into 3 categories. Afloat requirements, that's jobs or billets for all afloat units, ships, squadrons, submarines. Shore requirements, billets for all shore activities, such as the OPNAV staff, schools or supply depots. And finally, the individual's account, which is the amount of time personnel spend in a non-productive status away from a duty station, such as travelling between duty stations or attending a Navy school in preparation for full duty.
So David, are there distinct processes for estimating the manpower requirements in the 3 manpower categories?
Yes, and they are developed by different offices in the Navy. Manpower requirements for afloat units are developed by the Navy Manpower Analysis Center, or NAVMAC. They produce documents which specify manpower requirements for ships and submarines and squadrons, using workload engineering and observations to categorize the work and the amount of labor required to accomplish the work. The starting point for these documents is a statement of required operational capability and the projected operational environment. The statement defines missions, required capabilities, and the mission environment. For example, the document may note that full surface warfare capabilities need to be achieved and sustained for 60 days at sea in wartime. NAVMAC afloat manpower requirements documents follow a reproducible method for estimating requirements, and they are accepted as reasonably accurate throughout the Navy, the Department of Defense, and Congress. Manpower requirements for shore activities are governed by the Shore Manpower Requirements Determination, or SMRD, program. The starting point is a mission, function, and task, or MFT statement. Missions are concise, unclassified, general statements of what the activity is to accomplish. Functions are the workload derived from the main elements of an activity's mission. Tasks are workload accomplished in connection with existing program policy directives or written tasking assignments. Each shore activity requires an MFT statement, and commands prepare them for organizations under their administrative chain of command. The Shore Manpower Requirements Determination Program determines and validates shore manpower requirements based on valid approved workloads. There are some fundamental differences between the processes to determine shore and afloat manpower requirements. Commands determine their own requirements for shore manpower, whereas NAVMAC determines afloat manpower requirements. Afloat manpower requirements are typically more concrete and easier to measure than shore manpower requirements. For example, afloat units conduct a significant amount of maintenance. The extent of such maintenance is based on statistics from preventive maintenance schedules and inspected failure times. Conversely, MFTs typically contain many tasks that are less defined. For example, one of the missions of the Naval War College, a shore establishment, is to educate and develop leaders. The MFT statement for the Naval War College is well written and appropriate. However, it addresses tasks with manpower requirements that are hard to quantify, which is the nature of shore establishment requirements.
So David, now let's move to the individual's account. As you know, personnel for both afloat and shore activities may be in training, moving between duty stations, sick in the brig, and so forth. But the Navy still has to budget for and pay its personnel. This is accounted for in the individual's account.
Yes, that's true, Jeff. The determination process for the individual's account is largely statistical and based on MPT&E plans, size of the force, extensive length of training courses, etc., and historical size of the individual's account. However, execution of the account has been an almost constant problem within Navy MPT&E. The number of personnel in the individual's account often exceeds the number of billets allocated for them, largely because of the hesitancy of the Navy, the Department of Defense, and Congress to properly fund the individual's account. This is because personnel in the individual's account are not directly contributing to Navy readiness. In fact, they are a draw on readiness.
So let's talk about funding for a few minutes and how the Navy pays for its manpower needs. Programming is the process of providing funding to the required billets. It's a multi-year process with many moving parts. Programming takes place within the Department of Defense's Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution, or PPBE, process. Obviously, Congress is involved, but there is a fairly detailed process that must play out before the Congress makes its appropriations. Let's look at this chart where David has laid out the four components of the PPBE process. Planning, which establishes strategic priorities and capabilities required to achieve the strategy. Programming, which applies resources to programs that provide the capabilities required to achieve strategic priorities. It is a top-down process that allocates future resources between competing requirements, and it's the starting point for the budget. Budgeting properly prices the programs and is a bottom-up process that provides detailed cost estimates and identifies disconnects between guidance from planning and programming on the one hand and recent execution on the other. Execution performs the approved plan. At each of these steps, military manpower is one of the budget categories addressed, along with other categories in the DoD budget, such as acquisition of new weapons and research and development.
Yes, that's true. The PPBE process results in a 7-year Future Years Defense Program, commonly called the FIDP. The current, that's execution year, next year the budget year, and 5 program years beyond the budget year. Manpower authorizations are aligned to the FIDP. It's an iterative process. Each year the PPB&E process produces plans, updates previous plans that are now a year closer to execution, and develops a new plan for the year that is now moved into the FIDP time horizon. The graphic shows the nature of the overlapping cycles. The end products of manpower programming are authorized billets, which are authorized when Congress provides funding.
So, David, what are some of the key issues regarding the budget process?
Well, there are several, including congressional constraints, single-year funding, and discretionary spending. High-level policies, directives, and constraints are typically not very detailed. For example, Congress pays for a fixed number of Navy billets, but does not specify which billets. Congress provides 2 constraints in the military personnel, or MPN account: a specified number of dollars to pay for personnel, and a limit on the number of personnel that may be on active duty at the end of the fiscal year, known as end strength. The number of Navy personnel on active duty varies throughout the year, and the average cost of a sailor also varies during the year. Managing personnel to stay within MPN dollar limits and also meet end strength goals is a central part of Navy MPT&E. The MPN appropriation is for a single year. However, as we said earlier, many MPT&E issues require considerations of actions that occur over many years. There are many occasions when optimal decisions may require spending now to be in a better situation several years in the future. However, single-year appropriations do not lend themselves to spending for the future. and the legal imperatives to not overspend the MPN account frequently results in long-term negative effects and inefficiencies. Every manager wants some discretionary spending so they have a little leeway in how they manage their budget. The Chief of Naval Personnel, despite having a large budget, has limited ability to vary expenditures. This is because most MPN expenditures follow directly from the number of authorizations. If there are personnel in uniform, they will get paid. In addition, the MPN account includes obligations for providing healthcare funding to military retirees. Consequently, there are few options to save MPN dollars without reducing the number of personnel in uniform, an option that is both militarily and politically unacceptable.
Thank you, David. Let's turn our attention just for a second now to personnel planning. There are many disparate tasks and issues regarding the management of Navy personnel, including recruiting, training, compensation, and so forth. An overarching fact that underlies all of personnel planning is the closed labor market of military personnel. Personnel enter with zero experience and gradually develop over the years. If we want 100 personnel with 10 years of experience next year, we need at least 100 personnel with 9 years of experience this year. This next chart, which captures fundamentals of the closed labor market, is ubiquitous in Navy personnel management, the length of service distribution. David, tell us what we are seeing in this chart.
The graphic shows a recent length of service distribution for personnel in the Operations Specialist or OS rating. There are approximately 850 OS personnel with 3 years of service, 550 OS personnel with 4 years of service, and so on. If we want to forecast how many personnel will have 5 years of service 1 year from now, we take the number of personnel who currently have 4 years of service, that's 550, and multiply it by the percentage of personnel with 4 years of service that we expect to remain on active duty for the next year. If we iterate these computations, we can compute how many personnel remain or survive for 2 or more years. Personnel planning requires forecasts of how many personnel with a particular experience level the Navy will need years from now and what actions the Navy should take to ensure that it has a sufficient number of such personnel. Current continuation rates may not lead the Navy to having sufficient personnel with 10 years of experience 3 years from now, which could lead to introducing re-enlistment incentives to retain sufficient personnel. The next slide shows the pay grade pyramid structure for all enlisted personnel billets based on recent authorizations. Following Navy practice, the lowest billet pay grades E1 to E3 are grouped together. We can see that the so-called pyramids are not exactly pyramid shape. Notably, there are fewer E4 authorizations than E5 authorizations. The reason is that personnel may remain in one pay grade much longer than another, so authorizations for one grade will be spread over a different number of cohorts than authorizations for another grade. Numerous implications may be derived from pay grade pyramids, notably in the area of advancements. Advancements in the Navy are vacancy-driven processes and computed separately for each skill area. For example, the number of personnel who advance from E4 to E5 is based on the number of vacancies at E5, that is E5 authorizations less E5 inventory, and the number of vacancies will tend to increase as the number of E5 authorizations grow.
So, David, we need to drill down from the overarching consideration of a closed labor market and address the distinct areas in personnel planning one at a time. So let's talk about top-down versus bottom-up planning. Let's start with a few key facts. First, personnel planning can be top-down or bottom-up. The top-down planning ensures that Navy personnel meet budget constraints and high-level guidance. This top-level planning is called strength planning. The MPN appropriation provides funds for all aspects of personnel compensation, base pay, incentive pays, and so forth, and the costs of moving personnel between duty stations. To manage the budget, the Navy sets limits on personnel plans, for example, total accessions, total change of station moves, and phases personnel actions throughout the year to adjust the costs. The actions that are phased include accessions and promotions. The end result is a strength plan that will enable the Navy to meet the constraints of the MPN appropriation.
That's right, Jeff. However, much of personnel planning follows a more detailed bottom-up approach, starting at individual skill levels and aggregating them to obtain overall plans. There is an obvious need for the individual plans to be aligned with the top-down strength plans, but this consistency is difficult to attain. Inconsistencies that lead to inefficiencies in personnel management occur all the time. So let's talk about community management. Navy personnel are divided into communities according to their expertise. For example, surface warfare officers is an officer community and sonar technicians is an enlisted community. Each community is managed separately and planning for individual communities is called community management. Community managers consider one community at a time and try to build and maintain an inventory of personnel in that community that meets distinct objectives or constraints that are personnel follow a career path that contains appropriate assignments as the careers develop, and the supply of personnel will meet current and future authorization limits, including meeting aggregate goals for numbers of personnel in each pay grade, numbers of personnel on sea duty, and the like. One of the major problems facing community managers is that they must abide by legal and fiscal constraints of policy guidance that are not always consistent. This frequently produces goals that cannot be met simultaneously, resulting in imperfect decision making. Let's look at an example of this. The Surface Warfare Officer Community Manager is faced with a situation where the pay grade pyramid of authorized billets has too small a base of junior billets to support the growth and development of the required number of more senior officers. In particular, the Surface Warfare Officer career path contains a number of milestone tours, including a department head tour after roughly 8 years of service. The Navy needs a sufficient supply of qualified officers to fill all the department head billets. Consequently, Surface Warfare Officer accession requirements are based on accessing a sufficient number of junior officers to fill the department head billets 8 years in the future. Unfortunately, this number is far in excess of the number of surface warfare ensign billets, forcing a difficult decision. Either access fewer officers in order to fill the current ensign authorizations and have a future shortage of department heads, or access sufficient officers to fill future department head billets and have excess ensigns. The Navy chooses the latter option. Better solutions to such problems require improved coordination between the many parts of the Navy that contribute to Navy MPT&E.
So David, let's talk about the first part of that process, the recruiting process. It's another factor that personnel planners have to take into consideration. Aptitude requirements are included in Navy recruiting goals and are measured in a test administered to all personnel endeavoring to enlist in the U.S. military, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, or the ASVAB. The Navy uses the ASVAB test to determine eligibility to join. ASVAB scores also determine potential recruit qualifications for individual military occupational specialties called ratings in the Navy. Navy ratings vary widely in their aptitude requirements. For example, a recruit must have a very high ASVAB score to enter an enlisted nuclear rating, whereas other ratings require lower test scores.
And Jeff, education status is also important. Roughly 1/3 of recruits leave the Navy before the end of their initial obligations, large numbers of them in the first year of service. Such losses are called first-term attrition. High school graduates have shown the tenacity to stay the course and achieve a goal, and we observe attrition rates for high school graduates are lower than for recruits who did not complete high school. Consequently, the services want recruits to be high school graduates, in addition to having high ASVAB scores. This has not been a problem in recent years because of the employment stability and relatively good compensation offered by military service. In times of a booming economy, however, it becomes increasingly difficult to recruit personnel, especially in high-tech skills in demand for many well-paid jobs in the private sector. In such situations, the Navy may need to recruit more personnel who perform well on the ASVAB test but are not high school graduates. The timing of when recruits enter the Navy as accessions during a fiscal year is also an important issue. The phasing of accessions is affected by a number of different and sometimes conflicting objectives. To take recruits as they are available, most often in the summer after high school graduation, to shift accessions towards the end of a fiscal year to save MPN expenditures, and to level load accessions throughout the year so there's a steady stream of recruits in the training pipelines. The development of the Navy's recruiting plans balances these considerations and attempts to find the best plan for the current situation and future requirements. For example, nuclear trained personnel require a lengthy, expensive education in which recruits train on a nuclear reactor. The number of personnel who can train on a reactor at any one time is limited, so it makes sense financially to level load accessions throughout the year. Incentives are used to support recruiting goals. For example, the Navy sometimes provides an enlistment bonus to attract recruits.
So the next step after the recruiting process is the training and education process for the Navy. Training and education are not the same. In the context of the Navy, training teaches a specific skill, especially by practice, and is used to prepare personnel for specific assignments, typically the current or next assignment. Education, on the other hand, focuses on learning new skills, knowledge, and perspectives, and is used to prepare personnel for future unspecified assignments. Enlisted personnel, being more vocationally oriented, receive more training than education. Officers receive a lot more education, preparing them for future, non-specific leadership assignments.
That's right, Jeff. All officers enter the Navy with an undergraduate degree. Most officers spend their first couple of years obtaining qualifications for a specific career. For example, prospective pilots learn to fly at Naval Flight School, attaining their designation as a pilot prior to an initial operational tour. Much of this learning is operational training, and officers continue to receive such training as their careers develop. For example, prospective commanding officers attend the school as part of preparation for taking command. Officers receive a variety of educational opportunities during their careers. The nature, extent, and timing of this education depends on the career path of an officer. This education will typically include joint professional military education that prepares officers for future assignments in a joint environment, and graduate education that broadly prepares officers for more senior leadership roles and also prepares officers for specialized careers such as engineering duty officers. The timing of the education is career path dependent. Officer careers are tightly defined and constrained. There are limited opportunities to receive education, and the opportunities vary by career specialty. For example, many surface warfare officers receive graduate education after they have completed their initial at sea assignments after 4 to 5 years of service. But pilots typically need to wait till they have completed more than 10 years of service before they have an opportunity for graduate education. Officer personnel planners develop training and education plans that try to accomplish all of these considerations. Enlisted personnel receive training throughout their careers. Here is the usual sequence. All recruits, except those with prior military service, attend Navy boot camp immediately after enlisting. Boot camp indoctrinates new recruits into the military and Navy way of life. After boot camp, sailors require and receive additional training for the skill they are entering. Most sailors attend an A school where they receive initial training for a particular rating. The length of A school varies greatly depending on the rating, ranging from 5 weeks to over a year. Highly technical and special forces ratings have the longest A schools. Some sailors receive additional specialized training after occupational specialty A school training. Such training at a C school will train a sailor in a particular subspecialty within the rating. For example, sailors entering the sonar technician rating may attend a C school where they will learn to operate a particular type of sonar. Personnel managers develop training plans for both A and C schools. A school plans are based on the need for new entrants into a rating, mostly focusing on current needs. C school plans are based on the future need for more specialized training. The rationale for the C school planning horizon is that it takes time to plan and schedule C schools, and C schools' lengths may be several months. Hence, today's C school planning may not produce C school graduates until years in the future. Overall, the Navy is one of the world's largest trainers. More than 30,000 personnel enlist in the Navy each year, and they all receive training throughout their careers. This costs a lot of money, and the search for efficiencies in training is a perennial issue. Navy training has had to adapt to budget constraints. The number of classes has been reduced, class sizes have grown, and many schools have been consolidated to one location. The reduced availability of schools has caused some students to waste a significant amount of time at school awaiting the start of a course they will attend. This unproductive time comes at the expense of undermanned commands. And while the consolidation of training from 2 or more locations to one location has saved significant training infrastructure costs, this consolidation has other costs. For example, the Navy now has to pay travel costs to fly personnel across country to receive training. Sometimes the lack of local training causes personnel to miss the training entirely. There's no easy answer to all of this. Finding the right balance between giving the best training to personnel and keeping the training budget under control is a constant challenge for personnel planners.
Thank you, David. Training and education is a huge part of what the Navy does, and it prepares people so that they're ready for the next part of the process that we're going to talk about, which is promotions and advancements. Another aspect of personnel planning addresses how personnel move up through the ranks. In Navy jargon, officers get promoted and enlisted personnel get advanced. Promotions and advancements are mostly vacancy driven. The number of personnel who advance from one grade to the next is equal to the number of vacancies at the next pay grade. There are underlying regulations regarding the timing of advancements and promotions that have a major impact on the structure of the personnel inventory.
Jeff, that's right. Officers and enlisted personnel are governed by very different regulations. First, let's discuss officers. Officer promotions are tightly managed and subject to numerous constraints, from congressional legislation to policies from the Department of Defense and the Navy. The 5 most important considerations are vacancies, time and grade requirements, competitive categories, promotion opportunity, and flow points. Let's go through them one by one. The number of vacancies is the difference between authorizations and the size of the inventory for that pay grade. Officers need to spend a minimum amount of time in a grade prior to promotion to the next grade. Officers compete for promotions within groupings of personnel called competitive categories. It's a service prerogative to define these competitive categories. Promotion opportunity is the ratio of the number of vacancies to the number of officers being considered for promotion for the first time. The flow point is the average number of years commissioned service officers have when promoted to the next higher grade. Congress provides guidance regarding promotion opportunity and timing. One of the most important jobs in officer personnel management is setting flow points, promotion opportunity and policies such as retention incentives to keep promotions within policy guidelines. Now, enlisted advancements are more fluid and more loosely managed than officer promotions. Personnel advance to fill vacancies, and the timing of advancement in a career is allowed to float in order to match advancements to vacancies. However, there are minimum time and grade requirements for advancements that set limits on how rapidly enlisted personnel may advance. There are no set limits to advancement opportunity, which varies as retention rates and changes in billet authorizations occur. Enlisted advancement is a key component of enlisted compensation. High-skilled communities typically have more senior pay grade structures than lower-skilled communities. This results in more advancement opportunities and more rapid advancements in the higher skilled ratings, hence higher compensations in the higher skilled ratings. This higher compensation is required in order to retain the more highly skilled personnel.
So David, this brings us to the discussion of compensation, which is a major tool that planners have to consider. And this is the final topic we will discuss within personnel planning, the topic of compensation. The starting point and foundation for military compensation is that all personnel receive basic pay, a housing allowance, and a subsistence allowance, as well as the federal income tax advantage that accrues because the allowances are not subject to federal income tax. This compensation varies with the pay grade, years of service, and family size of the individual service member. Congress legislates these compensation levels, and they apply to all of the services. The Navy has a variety of other forms of compensation that it uses to influence and manage personnel. Much of the MPT&E management is focused on the management of subsets of personnel, such as personnel on sea duty where the Navy is trying to influence personnel behavior. Compensation is a primary tool for influencing behavior, that is, giving money to personnel to join and or remain in scarce skill areas, giving money to people to spend more time at sea, and so forth.
Yes, Jeff, that's right. The Navy has a wide variety of incentive pays, including enlistment bonuses paid to recruits who join hard-to-fill skill areas, re-enlistment bonuses paid to personnel to re-enlist in ratings where the Navy has personnel shortages, sea pay paid to personnel to incentivize them to remain on sea duty for longer periods of time, hazardous duty pay paid to personnel who perform hazardous duties such as parachute jumping and demolition of explosives, and imminent danger pay paid to personnel in areas designated as dangerous. Setting appropriate levels of these targeted pays is a primary task for personnel planners.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about planning, and now we want to get into a little bit of a discussion about personnel execution. And that's going to be the final section of our webinar, personnel execution. Personnel execution is where, quote, the rubber meets the road, as Navy workforce managers endeavor to execute all their plans and attain an inventory that is distributed to meet all the various goals. Plans and their effects may extend over several years, but execution is measured and managed over the course of the current fiscal year. David will summarize three major processes that occur in personnel execution. The first is monitoring the execution of the plans. The second, the movement of enlisted personnel through training pipelines. And finally, personnel distribution, where personnel receive their assignments.
Thanks, Jeff. First, let's discuss monitoring execution of plans. Each fiscal year starts with plans for accessions, promotions, advancements, and so on. As the fiscal year progresses, managers monitor the progress of these plans while also tracking the progress to attaining end strength and ensuring the Navy stays within the NPN budget. There are many reasons why plans may not execute as desired. For example, retention may not be at forecast levels, recruits may not join the Navy at the plan rates, and there may be changes to the budget during execution. The Navy makes intra-year adjustments to each plan as necessary to remain on track for the execution year goal. Turning our attention to moving personnel through training pipelines, we note that there are many different training paths depending on the prospective ratings of the personnel. During the course of the training, some personnel drop out and leave the Navy, others are reclassified from one prospective rating to another and change training accordingly. The movement of personnel through training pipelines is difficult to understand and manage effectively. The Navy employs supply chain management methods to analyze this movement. Finally, let's address the process of assigning personnel to jobs. There are many different and frequently conflicting considerations regarding assignment decisions. Moreover, it's a large challenge. The Navy makes tens of thousands of assignments every year because personnel change duty stations every few years. Here's a simplified description of the distribution process. Personnel have assignments for a set period of time and have a projected rotation date when their assignment is coming to an end. 9 months before assignments come to an end, Navy personnel managers and the personnel start communicating to make follow-on assignments. The available potential assignments are based on vacancies that are forecast to occur 9 months in the future. Decisions regarding assignment are based on numerous criteria, including the following: the priority of the assignment, the preferences of the personnel, the cost of moving the service member and his or her family to the new location, billet gaps that arise when personnel arise after the vacancies occur, matching of all skills between personnel and billets, how much notice personnel are given regarding their move date, the pertinence of assignments for personnel career paths, the need for en route training, including the availability and timing of the training, and individuals' personal characteristics, for example, having an exceptional family member who requires special schooling or medical care, or having a spouse who is also on active duty. It's not an easy job to balance all of these disparate criteria in making assignments, and unexpected losses that frequently occur are a big disruption to the normal personnel assignment process. Currently, assignments are made in a sequential process, one at a time. Intuitively, this process seems amenable to an operations research approach in which multiple assignments are made simultaneously and an optimal set of assignments is attained. There have been numerous efforts during the past 30 years to build an automated optimal assignment process for Navy personnel. These efforts have failed largely because of the complexities and idiosyncrasies of Navy personnel assignments. Nevertheless, there is hope that progress in this area can and will be made in the not too distant future. Geographic stability is another perennial personnel distribution issue. Many personnel want to remain in one location, and the Navy tries to accommodate these requests while ensuring the Navy's needs are met. There are limits to how much geographic stability is attainable while filling outstanding requirements.
So David, I think a great final question to end this webinar is, how does the Navy assess the success of its plans and NPT&E management?
Good question. I've spoken about a wide variety of actions taken to obtain the correct Navy workforce. In all of my comments, I've addressed issues at some form of aggregate level, such as excess junior service warfare officers. However, fleet manning, the end goal, is measured at a disaggregated level. It measures the manning of individual units. The primary measure of unit manning addresses the extent that the inventory assigned to a unit matches the billets for the unit, considering both the quantity of personnel and their skills and seniority. Fleet Forces Command uses this measure to assess the success of Navy personnel managers in providing personnel to the fleet.
So, David, do you have any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I've tried to provide an overview of Navy manpower planning. I hope I've conveyed its complexity. There are few simple answers to the many issues facing Navy workforce managers. Good management decisions nearly always require flexibility and a broad perspective regarding their immediate and secondary or unanticipated consequences.
David, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and talking us through a complicated process. I know that those who have listened today have gained a wealth of knowledge. One final note, a copy of the handbook, Navy Manpower Planning, can be downloaded from CNA's website at www.cna.org. Thanks for watching and listening.